Welcome to our third week, where today we're going to look at the history of higher education. And some of you will probably have a natural love of history, enjoying historic fiction, enjoying historic movies and shows. But for some of us, it feels dry. It doesn't feel like it has any life to it. So I have invited Dr. Ruth Hayhoe to help bring this subject alive, help us to understand what pieces of the modern university that we work with actually have their roots in different systems, maybe 200 years old, or maybe 300 or 400 or 500 years old. So today I want to welcome Dr. Ruth Hayhoe. Thank you for coming.
I'm so happy to be here with you all.
And Dr. Hayhoe is active in our department. She teaches 2 courses, and they're offered every second fall. Right now, she's offering 3810, which is International Academic Relations. So this is a wonderful course. Ruth, you actually cover the international relations theories, the sort of the frameworks of international relations at the beginning. Is that right?
Yeah, it begins with sort of 4 paradigms that are widely used. The realist, which we're very familiar with, the liberal, both classical liberal, neoliberal, we hear a lot about that critically, and what's called compensatory liberal, which is another sort of piece within the liberal. Then the third very important one is the Marxist, and here we have dependency theory, world system theory, very important frames for comparative higher education. And then finally, my own favorite, a little bit less known, the world order models thinking, sometimes described as cosmopolitanism. I think that's the most common way of thinking about it, which is a valueless, explicit frame emphasizing human agency and possibility. So we do the 4 frames, and then we go into sort of thematic discussions around universities as actors in the global arena.
I think that'll be of interest to these students, especially those who will be here in 2 years, of the part-time students. I really recommend taking those courses. The other course Ruth teaches is 1825, which is Comparative Method and Theory. And this is particularly important for any students who want to have a comparative lens, looking at different countries or different regions in their research, looking at international activities. But what Ruth's courses are so valuable in is that Ruth doesn't just give you the latest 5 years of research. She helps us to begin to see the value in historic texts. What has been written over the last 100, 150 years on comparative research, the early thinkers moving into the 1960s and 70s. And then, of course, she does actually bring in historic current texts as well. So Ruth, I'm so glad you're here to help us understand the history of higher education. The students have 3 readings for this week. They have Cardinal John Newman. Some love it and lots of them hate it. So you're going to have to help us understand the value of that. And then, of course, Flexner's work from the 1930s, looking at the German university and what are the values undergirding that German university that then were actually transferred to North America and around the world. This is really the history of the research university. But you have also offered a piece on the Indian University and what its contributions to the world were. So I'm going to ask you to start, if it's okay. Why should we care about what Newman is trying to tell us in 1850 as he sets up the University of Dublin? Why is this important? And what remains? What still exists at the University of Toronto, for instance, that comes from this model?
That's a very good question, Grace. I think the first point that's really important when we look at the university is to recognize universities predated nation states by centuries. So we had already in Europe in the 11th and 12th century universities, while we were having empires, royal groups, and so on. Only in the 18th, 19th century did the nation state emerge, probably with the French Revolution. So how the traditions of the medieval European university were transformed in the different emerging nation states is very, very interesting and brings out a lot of differences. Canada, of course, was very influenced by the UK, also by France, also by Germany, and then later by the US. So looking at those differences, I think is very important. So Cardinal Newman, a very, very influential thinker and figure with his idea of the university in the 1800s. So England was just emerging as a nation state and really keeping a kind of core value of the medieval university, which of course was closely affiliated with the church. So he sees theology as the kind of field or discipline that integrates all the other forms of knowledge and brings them together and brings out their importance. And rather than thinking of university as a place that advances knowledge, he sees it as a place that forms people. Citizens who will be responsible, who will be caring. I found it very interesting, being a specialist on China, to find there are some parallels here with China's Confucian tradition, a very strong influence on morality, moral responsibility, spiritual development, and seeing that as a very key role of the university. And of course, Oxford and Cambridge universities were both closely affiliated with the Anglican Church in the UK. And that nurturing aspect, spiritual, moral, emotional, was just a very, very important part of their responsibility. And of course, most of the political leaders also came out of these universities, not only in the UK, but also in various colonies like India, Hong Kong, and so on. I still remember thinking, here we've got people from Oxford, civil servants in Hong Kong. They know Greek and Latin, but they don't know any Chinese, and they're nurtured by Oxford University. So I think it just helps you to understand. Of course, Oxford changed a lot since then, but I think understanding those roots and that sort of purpose, it had its own importance and logic, but it was, of course, not the only way of thinking about universities.
And I think that's so important for us, because a lot of our students coming into this program actually work in student affairs. And so here in student affairs, sometimes you'll feel like you're fighting an academic machine, that the students go out into these large lectures and then you bring them back to their res life and make sure they're okay, make sure that they're developing as humans. You would actually put a high value on their moral development, on their interpersonal skills, conflict resolution, all of these things that we want them to get in res life or in first year as they get transferable skills. And yet this is what Newman was concerned about. He was concerned that this generation of young elite men did not have deep moral grounding. And so one of the quotes from Newman that I love, it's probably my favorite, is when he says, you know, if a group of young men come together, young and eager as young men are, even if there be no one to teach them, just that community itself will be unto them a series of lectures in a classroom. And what he's trying to say is that there's something students get from university that is even outside of the formal knowledge that happens. It's this community of people. And I think that's what my student affairs students actually agree with. They say, yes, there's something happening even outside the classrooms that's part of this moral or social development for our students. So Newman, their religious and spiritual development actually is very formal. It's part of what these future church leaders and future leaders of the state are gaining. But he's actually articulating it in a really interesting way. We see those sort of leftovers of that at places like the University of Toronto that have strong Anglo roots.
Yeah, and that's why the colleges were very important, because in Oxford and Cambridge, main learning was the mentorship of their tutor. The lectures were formal and kind of separate. That's what you did, you know, to develop your knowledge of history or mathematics or whatever it was. But the close personal relationship, living together in a college, having meals together, having formal meals sometimes, and that was all part of the nurturing and mentoring. And with each student assigned a mentor who was, you know, responsible not for standing up and giving big lectures, but for gathering them around. And so in England, they talk about, I'm going to Oxford to read history or to read chemistry or whatever, you know, and they read under the guidance of a tutor. And then they take lectures as a separate thing. So it's interesting. And I think University of Toronto's colleges, particularly the original Trinity, Victoria, St. Michael's, and so on, very much paralleling the Oxford model.
That's right. And for students to understand that actually not all universities have a college model. That where I went as well at Trent, which was only started in the 1960s, they had a college model. And that's a very Anglo heritage thing to have, the roots in the UK. I think what's also interesting for those of you who have focus in your studies on governance, there's a huge debate between whether we have a collegial or a managerial system in our governance. And we're going to look at governance as one of the weeks in this course. And when you're looking at that debate, it's a question of how much power in decision-making the professors have. And so when we look back at the Anglo model, the Oxbridges, what do they call Oxbridge? The Oxfords and Cambridges, The professors who lived in residence there, they called them the masters, they decided everything from the menus to whether the land, they bought more land. They had power on every decision, not just the academic programs. And so that's why you'll often hear this tension when you look at current forms of governance, because people are wondering, to what extent do professors still have any power at the university? So Ruth, take us then to the 1930s. Abraham Flexner, who's writing about what's called the Humboldt model. So who was Humboldt, and why was he so significant? Why was he such an important shift?
Yeah, I mean, I think Humboldt model, this is a very interesting thing about the 19th century, that even though the largest colonial expeditions were done by the British and the French, the Germans were active, but much less so. But in terms of higher education, the Humboldt model became a model for the world. It had huge influence in the US, it had huge influence in Japan, the University of Tokyo, China, Peking, all over the world. And Humboldt founded the University of Berlin in 1810. And it was very interesting that it was a part of the Prussian civil service. So professors were civil servants, part of government, the university was part, but autonomy and academic freedom was strongly emphasized. And the strongest concern that Humboldt had was to integrate teaching and research. So every professor should be a researcher. And that means the students would be connected to the professor's research and would see knowledge being advanced. And in the German system at the time, they were also training highly effective technological students in what they call Technische Hochschule. The Technische Hochschule were more firmly controlled by the specialized ministries in Prussia. But the university was under education and was guaranteed a high degree of academic freedom around their own subject. However, they were not allowed, it was a pretty dictatorial system. They're not allowed to get out and protest on the streets on any political issues, but they could protest anything related to their own field of knowledge. And Humboldt felt that was essential to have an advancement of knowledge and to have, and I think I had an MA student quite a few years ago, who compared Germany and France. And France, of course, had much more specialized higher education. Academic freedom was associated with specialization, but research and teaching were separate. So research was done in academies and centers, and teaching in the university. So that integration of teaching and research was really the German contribution. And I think the Global Research University now, probably the deepest influence comes from originally Humboldt, and then the way it was introduced, not only by Flexner, but by many others to America. Yeah.
And you mentioned to me about Flexner being very involved in the the establishment of American medical universities. Is that right?
Yeah, so Flexner in the 1920s and 30s, this is in between the two wars, he was very concerned that American higher education was very practical, pragmatism, serving society. He thought it was ridiculous that areas like dressmaking or hairdressing could be taught in the university. He wanted to see a much more academic, scientifically oriented university, and universities doing research that would contribute to society in very significant ways. So what we had was many wonderful colleges. You look at Yale, Princeton, all of them, largely influenced by the British model originally, right? And doing good nurturing of students and scholars and building up communities and so on, and having a degree of autonomy, but not as much focus on research or the connection of research to teaching. So that's really what he brought. And so I think his contribution to medical education was considered one of the most important aspects of his work, the science of medicine, the status, the protection of that. The other institution that he founded, which till now is very famous, Princeton University has an Institute of Advanced Studies, which is for the highest level of not only natural science, any form of scholarship. And that was where Einstein spent his days, where he was protected, during the Nazi persecution of Jews and so on. So that institute, again, that universities should have a space for deep contributions to knowledge for its own sake, and then that overflowing into various kinds of improvements, innovations, and so on, not only in the natural sciences, also in the social sciences. Yeah, so his piece is pretty interesting from that perspective, that he strongly, and you see that German influence, although he was American, in his valuing of that research and teaching combination, and the really important responsibility of the university for research and advancing knowledge.
And I think that those of us who are interested in researching the knowledge economy, here's a term that many of you may have come across in other areas of work. So for those of you who came into this program thinking, oh, I want to understand this idea of the knowledge economy, we understand the history of where research was at the university and how some would say that that has ascended as the sort of the king of the activities at the university, that we're now tipped it from just research and teaching together to research now becoming something that gives us international ranking. So we'll have a week later in the program on research production and rankings to see where research now fits. So this is a history that's very important to understand, to see why research became part of what we do at places like the University of Toronto and how strong that is. So I'm interested in this transfer of knowledge, because we know that a lot of this happened through European colonialism or British colonialism. But the third piece the students have to read is actually about the borrowing or the expansion of Indian higher education to East Asia. So tell us, why did you write this piece? What was the conference about? I know the students have a little intro, but it was kind of a special alumni, one of our alumni who organized this. Tell us a little bit about the background of why you wrote this piece.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so happy to do that. I had a doctoral student a few years ago from Cambodia. He completed his doctorate, I think it was around 2015. He went back to Cambodia. And the Comparative Education Society of Asia, which had tended mainly to meet in major capitals, Peking, Tokyo, whatever, were deciding we need to reach out to some other Asian countries and give them the opportunity to host. It's every 2 years. So they chose Cambodia. Well, my student Piram had just returned a year or so before, so he got support to host the Comparative Education Society of Asia's meeting in Angkar Wat, this amazing ancient capital of Cambodia, which is a huge center of archaeological research and very, very great interest. So of course I had to go. I was happy to be able to go. And then they asked me to do a keynote lecture. And I thought, my goodness, I'm going to have to do some reading and research and thinking to think what to do. And the more I read about this wonderful city of Angkor Wat, which was, it was a monastery, it was a city, it had amazing agriculture. In the 11th and 12th century, it was actually having a huge influence in the region. Later, it was invaded by Thailand, and by the 14th or 15th century, things went downhill. Later, of course, it became a colony of France. So all those things came later, but this was a time of its greatest prosperity and height. And I wanted to try to understand, it was like a university, although I don't know that we can use the word university. It was a center of learning, very important center of learning. How did that happen? Well, I discovered that the influence of Indian monks was a huge piece in what had happened, that the Indian monks had come, they had brought Buddhist texts, which were very important, in Sanskrit. You find still a lot of the monuments have Sanskrit as well as Khmer. Khmer is a local language. But they'd also brought very significant knowledge in agriculture. So the rice growing was very successful, and other areas of knowledge. And they had contributed very much to this becoming a very important center of learning that attracted people from quite far there to learn and study, both for the scientific, practical knowledge and also for the spiritual and religious knowledge there. So I became fascinated. And one of the points I was just sharing with Grace earlier, that I thought to myself, well, India had the caste system already by this time. We're talking about 7th, 8th, 9th century AD. India, of course, had higher learning going back to, I think, Taxila, now in Pakistan, had a first university in somewhere like 700 or 800 BCE, very, very early. But later, the caste system came in. Women were disadvantaged. The very early Indian universities, women were very active, but later they had to marry young, and they were not given the kind, as in most traditional societies, they were not given equal access. But anyways, to me, it was very fascinating. It wasn't Indian officials or part of the reigning system. It was monks that brought the knowledge, and they did not leave any kind of regulations or anything that reflected that part of Indian society at the time. So as I looked at that and researched that, I began to look at China's relationship to India. I had already known that in addition to Confucianism, which is the sort of major intellectual heritage in China, and particularly shaped the formal civil service examination system, which is seen as a kind of model of bureaucracy, meritocracy, scholars chosen through examination. And in fact, Europe was strongly influenced. We tend to forget it, but in the medieval European university, all exams were oral. It was only in the 17th, 18th century through writers like Matteo Ricci from Italy, who went to China in the 1600s, that the whole idea of written exams in order to select rulers who would be based on their knowledge, not their family heritage or their aristocratic background and so on. That was seen as very advanced. So China had that. But what the Indians brought to them was something really very interesting and different. So starting in about the 3rd or 4th century AD, Chinese monks who had come to believe in Buddhism decided they didn't know enough. They needed more texts, traveled to India. Some of them spent as long as 20 or 30 years. So the article that you're going to be reading will tell you about that. Collecting texts, staying in different scholarly centers, monastic centers, then bringing those texts back and translating them into Chinese. And then in China, in the 8th or 9th century, a new institution arose quite separate from the civil service exam, which was part of government. And these were called shuyuan in Chinese, or academy. They were independent. They were in rural areas, and they were places where there could be free discussion of many topics. And they were very much sort of informal learning places, reading, following texts, following monks and so on. Every so often the government would shut them down, but they would always revive again. And what I saw was this heritage from India brought an amazing balance. So on the one hand, you had the meritocracy. That was good, but it could be corrupted. It could be abused by those in power who wanted to help their families and so on. Whereas this separate system of academies or shuyuan was a kind of balance that would bring a critical voice. There would be some protection. They actually learn from the Indian monks how to look after rural land and grow enough to be able to sustain their simple lives while they studied and wrote texts and had discussions. So, there were places of learning like that. So it was amazing. Now, there's just one more piece that's really interesting about them. There were, starting in about the 7th or 8th century, there started to be learning centers for women. So originally, women were, in the Chinese context, only able to function within the family. They would teach their children and so on, but there was no separate learning for women. But through Buddhism, Buddhist nunneries developed where women would step out of the family, they would live independently, they would form communities, they would serve society, they would write poetry, they would do research, they would write books, and there's a very long heritage. And in an interesting way, if you go back to early India, you find in the very early years, there was a lot of space for women, but not the later years. So that whole piece was fascinating. And then just one more little piece. There's I don't know if you know the term bodhisattva, but that's explained in there. So a bodhisattva is a monk who reaches nirvana, but instead of entering nirvana, comes back to save the world. So there's a whole version of Buddhism around this. And the bodhisattvas became female in about the 6th or 7th century. The very same time, Syrian monks brought Christianity across the Silk Road to China. They were welcomed by the Buddhists. They created a library. They set up communities. And they, of course, brought Mary. So there was it's not been firmly researched, some sense there was some interconnection here between the space of women really being highly respected. And so there's one female bodhisattva, I'm just trying to pull up her name right now, very, very well known in China, Japan, and Korea, who really emerged in this period of time, really between the 6th and the 8th century. And you will find her everywhere in East Asia. So space for women was also a piece in this whole story.
And
Sorry,
I
I
feel,
went too long there, I think.
oh, it's not too long. My students, they're all going to be captivated as I am.
And you'll get more details in the paper, including
Yeah,
the
that's
name
right.
of the
Yeah, they have to be the
famous bodhisattva that jumped out of my head this moment.
Oh, but I love that. I think for me, one of the pieces of looking at higher education historically, especially having grown up in Canada, did my formal education in Canada, where we do have the importance of a secular public system, that spiritual or religious history was very lost to me. And so to think that there were these people who were from a spiritual position were interested in knowledge. They wanted to understand how the world worked, and they traveled across borders. The idea of monks coming and living in India for 20 or 30 years just because they were deeply seeking knowledge. Can you imagine if our undergraduate degrees were 30 years long because you had to really seek your knowledge? You weren't allowed to start your career until you were 50. And this to me paints a very different picture of the Western institution that I know in the 21st century. And so we in this class will talk a lot about institutions that are in Ontario, institutions that are in Canada, and these institutions have an Anglo heritage from the Oxford-Cambridge model, but they also have the research university from the Humboldt model. So all of that is good, and it's important for us to understand. But for those of you who love history, there is a huge world out there of researching different cultural traditions outside of the European context to see what was happening, what core beliefs were there, what subjects were studied. And as Ruth has mentioned, there are examples of higher learning centuries before the European university in current day Bangladesh, in places like Angkar Wat, and of course the Chinese Shuyuans. So please enjoy reading up on this. There are additional readings that are selected for you in this section, as well as in our comparative education section. And there's a third course that Ruth developed that I have a huge privilege to teach. It's one of my most favorites at OISE, and it's 1826 comparative higher ed. So if this is of interest to you, looking deeply into history to see how different systems emerged, how it reflects culture and religion, and the values that we all hold, you can join me in the spring for that. So Ruth, thank you so much for helping us. This has been a wonderful.
Look forward to meeting you when we have the class.
Yes. So Ruth is going to join us for 1 hour.
Discussion, whatever. I'll be delighted.
That's right. We'll have Ruth to answer our questions. So thank you for joining us today. Read those articles. And of course, if you find there's things you don't understand with language, bring those as real questions. Those are the things we want to probe into. So thank you again, Ruth.